Thanks for listening to this podcast of Trending with Timmerie. If you haven't already subscribed, please catch us wherever you love to listen to your podcast, from the Relevant Radio app to Apple, YouTube, you name it, we are there. And if you listen on Apple Podcasts, please be sure to go and give us a 5-star review to help other people discover the podcast. Anything you share in terms of episodes, whether it's texting it to a friend, posting on social media, helps to build up the kingdom for God, to help confront the challenging issues we face as a culture, but with joy, with hope, and with an eternal perspective where our faith collides with everyday life, bringing eternal principles to help us live our life joyfully.
So, what's trending? Bridging your Catholic faith with your everyday life. You're listening to Trending with Timmerie on Relevant Radio.
It's our weekly marriage hour today on Trending. If you have a question related to dating, relationships, and the end goal of marriage, the number's 1-888-914-9149. We're going to talk about why gender matters in marriage, out of marriage. We're going to dive into much of what we're seeing, everything from Ketanji Brown Jackson, who says she cannot define what a woman is, to a man named Will Thomas, who calls himself Leah Thomas, who takes a test, and now he says that he's a woman. He's allowed to win a division national swim championship because of that. We'll also talk about a 19-year-old biological female who committed suicide after transitioning to be a so-called boy. We're going to set the record straight and share truth and give answers and clarity to the issue today. Again, taking your questions on the topic of marriage. And I will share with you my thoughts on Ketanji Brown Jackson as the confirmation hearings have occurred all week long. I find it fascinating that we're even at where we're at with the potential of confirming her to the Supreme Court of the United States, the highest court in the United States. I find it absolutely ghastly that we're even considering her as a Supreme Court justice. And the reality is that we need to pray with regard to this confirmation. I think that it's inappropriate that she's been chosen due to identity politics. I think that that's offensive toward women. And also, it's offensive towards children if you follow some of her rulings. We'll dive into more of that in just a little bit. But let's talk about sex differences and why gender matters. When sex differences continue to become a problem, how does this play out? Again, everything from marriage to not in marriage. We've seen kids today, young children, are encouraged to believe that sex or gender are social constructs, that they need to come out, explore themselves, explore their identity, explore their own bodies, and to then deconstruct their gender to the point where they find themselves to be utterly and completely confused. There's a transgender craze sweeping the nation, especially among young girls. We'll talk about that in just a moment. But it begs the question, in this culture we live in, does biological sex matter? Is it patriarchal? Are neuroscientists neurosexist when they bring out sex differences? We'll talk about that in just a moment with Dr. Leonard Sax. Dr. Leonard Sax is a family physician and psychologist. He's written books on everything from parenting, gender, to boys and girls. He's personally been involved in cases where schools have encouraged girls to transition without parental notification. And he's seen cases where custody battles have been lost when a parent tries to help a child stay in line with their biological reality rather than following a school ushering them into a transgender identity. You're listening to Trending with Timmerie. Dr. Leonard Sax joins me now. Dr. Sax, welcome back to Trending.
Thanks for inviting me back.
You are, and have been for a number of years now, at the forefront of this battle surrounding gender. Can you share with us some of the latest research and how scientists actually know about the innate differences between girls and boys, and how this indicates sex differences not just based on nurturing, but even going all the way back to the child developing in the womb?
Yes. You know, it's remarkable. The research is so stunning. And yet, if you get your news from the New York Times and National Public Radio, you would not know this research exists. So let me give you one example. an astonishing study. Researchers from multiple universities across the United States got together to do a study in which they did MRI scans of women in the third trimester of pregnancy, looking inside the brain of the baby in the womb. This is fantastically advanced technology to be able to image the baby's brain in real time in great detail, actually determining what areas in the baby's brain connect to what other areas in the baby brain. These are babies 30, 32, 34, 36 weeks gestation, still in their mother's wombs. And you find astonishing differences between girl brains and boys' brains in the connections that are made, in the appearance of the brain, in the connectivity of the brain. And I wrote an essay on this for Psychology Today, called "A New Study Blows Up Old Ideas About Girls and Boys." And I'm embarrassed to say that my essay for Psychology Today is the only coverage that this initially got in the American media. Then the Catholic news media picked it up. It never got any mention in any major American newspaper or in any major media. Nobody covered it, because this study and others like it show very clearly that humans are made male or female. It's not something that happens after birth. I mean, certainly a lot of important things after you're born, but when the baby is born, the baby is, Genesis 1:27, in the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. That's a pretty good summary of this latest research. You are created male or female. When you come out of the womb, you are male or female. And the authors emphasize this was not a question of overlapping distributions. There were patterns seen in girls that were not seen in any boys. There were patterns seen in boys that were not seen in girls. The brain development was radically different between girls and boys, and yet no coverage of this in mainstream American media.
And it's interesting to see, because as you're looking at the MRIs, the significance of females having greater brain volume in the womb than little boys. What does this say moving forward about how women think later on? Is there any significance that can be drawn to help us understand this example?
The problem with any brain study is that there's so much we don't know about the brain. So, for example, men on average have bigger brains than women do. Does that mean that men on average are smarter than women are? No, it doesn't mean that. Although 100 years ago, it was widely accepted that men were smarter than women because the average man has a bigger brain than the average woman. How you get mind out of brain remains a mystery. We can show pictures of MRI scans, but anyone who says, I understand how we get the experience of hunger or love or disgust out of brain activity, they're giving you a line. We don't understand this. We don't understand how you get from neural activity to emotional experience or sensation or perception. These remain mysteries. So what can you say about any MRI scan? Can you say that because your MRI scan looks this way, you're going to be smart or less smart? No, you can't say any of those things. What we can say based on the MRI scans is that neuroanatomically, girls and boys are born different. What the significance of those differences are, we can debate, but I think it's quite interesting that this study and others like it that show these dramatic anatomical differences present before birth have received no mention in mainstream media. And I believe that's in part because they contradict the mainstream American position right now, which is that gender is just something that society invents and kids can be anything they want to be. I'll give you one example. I spoke recently for Trinity United Presbyterian Church in Santa Ana, California. I led 2 days of workshops there. This is Orange County, California, so roughly halfway between Los Angeles and San Diego. And a teacher there told me how she's after years of trying to get pregnant, she and her husband, she's finally pregnant, and she's very excited about finally being pregnant. And she shared with a fellow teacher at work, she said, "We just found out I'm having a boy." And her coworker said, "Don't you think you should let the baby decide?" And Mom was like, "That was when I knew I had to leave California." This is actually common in Los Angeles, in the Bay Area, that it's now, intelligent people let the baby decide, which means you give the baby an ambiguous name like Apple or Sandy, and then at 3 years of age, you ask the baby, "Are you a boy or a girl?" And based on what the 3-year-old tells you, that boy is now set on a path. You change his name to Emily. You change the birth certificate to Emily. Justin never existed. And you set him on the path that leads to puberty blockers, castration, infertility. This is happening right now. And this is
as ridiculous as the trend. Oh, absolutely. This is as ridiculous as the trend we saw, I think, about 5 years ago, when this woman was actually going on national television encouraging people to ask their dependent newborn babies and infants permission to change their diaper. I mean, it's so silly that we've gotten to the point where we're saying, oh, well, gender, sex, it's all social constructs. It's nurture, not nature. The reality is that there's a purpose, there's a function to the body. And I find it so fascinating, Dr. Sax, because the same people who fight for science, who fight for self-improvement, self-betterment, how to get better sleep, all of these mind-body life hacks, they're following the science. But when it comes to the reality of who we are as a male or as female, they're completely throwing out the research, ignoring the truth of the matter. And the reality is that we're seeing this is impacting young girls, young boys. It's impacting our marriages. That's why I want to talk about the trend we're seeing. And if you're just joining me now, you're listening to Trending with Timmerie here on Relevant Radio. That's Dr. Leonard Sax. You can find him at leonardsax.com. We'll include links in the podcast notes for today's show. He wrote a book titled Why Gender Matters, along with Girls on the Edge, a book for boys and for parenting. He's an incredible resource in the face of this battle over sexuality and so-called gender. We saw about 10 years ago an occasional young girl who might struggle with gender dysphoria. Well, just this week, a story broke of a mother in Southern California. She's speaking out after her 19-year-old daughter committed suicide in Los Angeles. She's accusing the Los Angeles County School for being responsible after they ushered her into an LGBTQ ideology, helped her to transition, join various LGBTQ clubs, and they did this all without the mother's permission, secretly behind the mother's back. Yaley Martinez was coached by an older transgender student, just like many of these young girls are coached online by their so-called glitter families. That's what they refer to themselves as, because we're wonderful, we'll help you, we'll support you, we'll love you, we'll help you do anything. Well, this mom's speaking out. She even shares that her daughter was coached by a transgender student to talk to a social worker so that she could be placed in foster care, so that then in the state of California, the state could fund her sexual transition to the so-called other sex. Dr. Sax, you have been involved in cases of young girls who have gone through the same exact situation of custody battles with parents, the school system ushering them into an LGBTQ identity. Can you share with us a little bit about your experience and the thoughts on this particular case of Yaley Martinez?
Yeah, it's really upsetting. So in another case where I was personally involved, the daughter was struggling and she was anxious and she was depressed, and she found a clip on TikTok that said, if you're anxious and depressed, maybe you're anxious and depressed because you're trapped in the wrong body. Maybe you're really a boy trapped in the body of a girl. And TikTok knows you better than you know yourself. It knows what buttons to press. It's really creepy. So many kids have told me it's just weird that TikTok knew I was trans before I did, is a really common line online. You'll find a lot of kids saying this. And So she decided, oh, that's me. That's the answer. I just need to transition to the male role and then I'll be happy. And so she began this transition without the knowledge of her parents. And the school is calling her Jason, and the parents don't even know this is going on. They notice that she's dressing a little differently. She's not using makeup anymore. But they are deliberately cut out of the loop. The school is not informing the parents as a matter of policy. And again, in California, and there are some other states, but California is the most extreme in this regard, where a teacher could be disciplined. If a teacher says, I think I'm going to call the parents, let them know what's going on, that teacher could lose their job. You're not allowed to inform the parents unless the kid wants you to, and this kid didn't. And so the parents find out eventually, like a year later, what's going on, and they say, look, this is not in our daughter's best interest. She is still anxious and depressed. Transitioning hasn't helped her, and this is not the right way to go for her. And so sure enough, the school got Child Protective Services involved, and the parents lost custody of their child. And the whole Child Protective Services there is saying, well, do you want a dead daughter or a live son? Threatening the parents that your daughter's going to commit suicide, your child's going to commit suicide if you don't endorse their transition, assuming that transitioning will improve the kid's mental health. Well, we know it doesn't. 10 years ago, you might still have claimed that in certain cases, transitioning to the other role, transitioning from male to female or vice versa, would improve outcomes. We can now say with confidence that it does not. And I've seen this firsthand. This kid is anxious and depressed. They think that transitioning to the male role is going to fix everything. They transition, and it doesn't fix anything. On the contrary, I have had so many trans kids say to me now, well, being trans, you're going to be miserable, because in addition to all the problems they had before, they're now trying to be male in a female body. And what are you going to do? Well, in California, there are a number of 13-year-old girls who've had bilateral mastectomies at age 13. Girls who've had both breasts removed.
Sterilization.
Yeah, talking about permanent outcomes, and starting these puberty blockers, and especially trans-sex hormones. As a practicing physician, a young person comes in. This individual was born female, is now presenting as male, taking high-dose testosterone to masculinize their appearance, but also taking female hormones in the form of birth control pills so they don't get pregnant. Male testosterone with estrogen together, and now I'm supposed to prescribe a medication for their
depression,
irritable
anxiety,
bowel syndrome.
suicidality.
Well, in order to prescribe a medication, I have to know is it safe to prescribe this medication in someone taking estrogen and testosterone together? How many studies are there studying the effects of birth control pills taken with high-dose testosterone in the same individual? There are none. There are no peer-reviewed studies. These kids are guinea pigs. They are subjects in an experiment on their own body to which they have not given informed consent because they have no clue what they're doing.
It's not possible. I want to jump in here because what you're saying is so important. In the Crisis Pregnancy Center where I worked for 5.5 years, I would see the counselors firsthand were experiencing where these young girls were coming in, and about 10 years ago we started to see the trend of kids who were identifying as bisexual, transgender, but they were still sexually active. And so like you said, they were on hormonal birth control. The trend toward normalizing cross-sex hormones for teenagers and young adults wasn't as common then. But the reality is that these girls are already experiencing systems that are in shock from the hormone replacement therapy occurring with just birth control itself, which is another topic we've discussed here on Trending. We'll include a link to one of the podcasts where we discuss some of the damage of that. But it's fascinating because no one's saying what you're saying, Dr. Sachs, where we're adding then testosterone on top of that, causing so many health issues. We're seeing this rise in healthcare costs, this rise in anxiety, depression, irritable bowel syndrome, digestive issues. We are not doing any service to young people today, yet at the same moment, Dr. Sachs, we're seeing states such as Oregon where a minor about the age 15 can go and receive cross-sex hormones, transgender testosterone hormone replacement therapy without any parental notification or involvement. How this is medically allowed is unbelievable. Do you foresee this being cracked down upon in the medical community, or do you think that it's really going to take people, parents speaking up and intervening?
I do think it's going to. I think the days are numbered. I don't think this is going to last much longer. And the reason is Carabelle. So Carabelle is a young woman who in England who at 16 was anxious, depressed, miserable, and again came across one of these online videos that said, maybe you're a boy trapped in a girl's body. And again fell under this notion that, oh, if I could just be a man, that would fix it. And so she underwent bilateral mastectomy, both breasts removed, and began male hormone. And then a few years later, she realized, I'm still miserable, except now I've got big scars on my chest where my breasts used to be, and my voice is weird, and my face doesn't look like me. But you know what? I'm still a woman. Mm-hmm. And she detransitioned, and she sued. She sued the center in England that had said, "Hey, yeah, absolutely, you want to be a boy? Well, done. And let's give you the hormones. Let's cut off the breasts. Absolutely. That's affirming. That's gender affirming treatment. That's what enlightened people do." And she said, "I was never counseled. I was never even diagnosed. No one ever really did a careful evaluation to see how I was hurting inside." And so she sued, and her case went to the High Court in London, and she won. And as a result of that case, things are changing across England. The centers are shutting down. They're saying, we're not going to do this on minor kids under 18 years of age anymore. We're just not going to, because we're scared. We're scared of getting sued. Mm-hmm. And I think ultimately the lawyers are going to put a stop to this, because fear of liability, I think, is what's going to change American practice.
Praise God. I mean, this is where we have to fight this on the school level, academic level. We have to fight this in universities with the indoctrination, but we have to fight this medically to keep kids safe. It's outstanding that parental notification is required at school to give a child an aspirin, but it's not in order to have an abortion, receive counseling for a cross-sex identity, cross-sex hormones. So this is why we must talk about this. The reality of who we are as a male and female is fundamental. It's written into our bodies, our souls, our minds. We're talking about the neuroscience. We'll come back during our weekly marriage hour today with Dr. Leonard Sax talking about why gender matters even within the context of marriage. You smell those stinky socks, ladies? He doesn't? Well, does this have to do with sex differences? I'll share that with you in just a minute.
So, what's trending? Bridging your Catholic faith with your everyday life. You're listening to Trending with Timmerie on Relevant Radio and the Relevant Radio app.
As the battle ensues over what is male, what is female, can you even define it? I am astounded that Ketanji Brown Jackson, potentially our next Supreme Court Justice, couldn't even answer a simple question of what a woman is. I will talk about this in a moment. I'm holding my tongue because we will get there in just a moment as confirmation hearings have continued for our next Supreme Court Justice. Everything from abortion child pornography sentencing to, yes, can you define what a woman is? We won't start singing the Shania Twain song. Please withhold that for the moment. She probably knows better. I don't know. Well, I digress. It's our weekly marriage hour today on Trending. And, something I noticed in marriage that smells, sounds, various things impact me radically differently than the way they impact my husband. And up until today, I had no idea that there is actually research diving into how we're hardwired differently as male and female, even at the level of smelling things, hearing things, in our own sight. Joining me now is Dr. Leonard Sax. We've been diving into the crisis surrounding suicidality among teenage girls after they transition to the so-called opposite sex, and why gender matters all the way down to the biological reality in the womb of sex differences. Fascinating context of information to know and help respond to the gender crisis. You can find Dr. Sax at leonardsax.com. He's a family physician as well as a psychologist. And Dr. Sax, help me to understand. You wrote an incredible piece online. In fact, you wrote it for the New York Times, having to do with everything from stinky socks to how men and women relate to one another. Share with us why these disagreements in marriage actually come down to male-female differences.
Yeah. Well, let me start with a story from my own practice. Again, I'm a family doctor, and husband and wife in my own practice went away for a long vacation, 2-week vacation in the middle of August. So it's hot. And when they come back to their home after being away for 2 weeks, the woman steps into the kitchen and she says, "Oh my goodness, something died. It rotted. It stinks. I think I'm going to throw up." And her husband says, "I don't smell anything." And as it happens, I saw both of them over the next few days. And the husband came in and he said, "My wife's going on and on about how it stinks and we got to hire some kind of contractor to rip open the wall and see what's rotting, and I don't smell anything." And I shared with him this research showing that for many odors, a woman's sense of smell is better than a man's. How much better? 5 times better? 10 times better? No. For many odors, it is 100,000 times more sensitive.
Whoa.
And I said to the man,
not just when she's pregnant, right?
That's right. I said to the man,
Okay.
You cannot argue with her. You cannot argue with her any more than a blind person can argue with a sighted person. The smell is real. It's overpowering. It's intense. You don't smell it. You got to hire the contractor. And as it happens, the woman came in and she said, "My husband is some kind of farm animal because the whole place smells like a rotting carcass on a pile of manure, and he claims he doesn't smell anything." And again, I shared with her the research, and I said, you can't be angry with him any more than a sighted person can be angry with a blind person. He doesn't smell it. He's not being difficult. He doesn't smell it. And, some pastors do premarital counseling when a man and woman are going to get married. I think that's a great idea. I think this should be part of it. I think a husband and wife need to understand that when the husband says, "I don't smell it," he's not being difficult. He's telling the truth. That the man and woman need to understand we're experiencing different sensory worlds. These differences are hardwired. They are found across mammals, and that's how we're made. And again, marriage is challenging for many reasons, and one is that we are experiencing different sensory worlds.
This is fascinating. It's funny because when we first got married, my big thing was, okay, I always want to make sure our bed is clean. You don't go to bed dirty, take a shower before you go to bed. And it turned into, okay, well, that's not realistic always. I remember me saying, okay, well, just make sure you wash your head every night before you go to bed, honey, so that the pillow doesn't smell. He's like, what do you mean the pillow will smell? And I've talked to so many wives who say, my husband's pillow smells. It smells like head. And it's the silliest, funniest thing. But you're diving into a difference that on such a micro level can be very significant in that male-female dimension and interaction throughout the day. That something might be a big deal to one spouse and be written off by another. How do we see this occurring not just in the context of smell, but also hearing things as well as sight?
Yeah. So hearing's another very good example. So it turns out that in order for a man to hear a sound, as loud as the woman hears it. You need to crank it up about 8 decibels. Got to be about 8 decibels louder for the man to hear it as well. So that's the equivalent of about 3 notches on a typical stereo or a radio, car radio. Got to turn it up about 3 clicks in order for the man to hear it as well. So if you're a woman and you share a car with a man and you get in the car and you turn on the radio, it's like, whoa, he's got that thing cranked up. You share a TV with a man, you turn it on, it's like, whoa, what is wrong with him? Is he deaf? Well, maybe, but maybe he's male. And this is so important because so many so many moms will tell me they don't think their husband's listening to them. Well, maybe he doesn't hear you. You need to speak more loudly. You need to raise your voice a little bit. Don't shout, but speak more loudly. Now, this works the other way as well. So, children have more sensitive hearing than adults on average. And at every age, females have more sensitive hearing than males. So let's now imagine a father, 45 years old, speaking to his daughter, who's 15 years old. Again, an example from my own practice. Doing a sports physical on this 15-year-old girl and just chatting with her, she said, my father's always shouting at me and I just don't like it. So I come home, I go in my bedroom, I close the door and I come out for meals, but otherwise I really try to avoid him. I don't like being shouted at. And with her permission, when I saw Dad, I said to Dad, Dad, your daughter shared with me that she feels like you're always shouting at her. And the father said, Dr. Sax, I never once shouted at that girl. You hear what I'm saying to you now. And I was like, yeah, okay, I heard. And I explained to him about sex differences in hearing and age differences in hearing. And I said, next time you talk to your daughter, whisper. I mean, not literally whisper, but lower your voice way, way down. And then a few weeks later, I bumped into the daughter, and she said, oh my gosh, my father can actually talk like a normal person.
Wow.
No one had ever told Dad that there are sex differences in hearing, that when you're speaking to a teenage girl, you need to lower your voice down. He's happy to make the accommodation. Nobody ever told him.
Wow, that's phenomenal. And it's so funny because just before we started the radio program, I broadcast live from my home studio. My husband got home from work. I had one of those moments where I finally said, okay, I need to vent. I've been talking to you since you got home and you've not been responding to me. And the frustration that can occur in marriage is so real. And it created a very frustrating evening for us here. So I think that this example that you gave of how in premarital counseling, some people will actually learn about these sex differences. I've dove into many of the sex differences in battling this gender crisis that we've seen. I have never come across or heard of the differences on the level of smell, hearing, or sight. Can you share with us about how this is different for sight as well between males and females?
So again, that's a major focus of my book, Why Gender Matters. All this research, again, which doesn't get covered in the mainstream media, but we've got an avalanche of research now showing that the visual system is wired differently in males compared with females, not just in humans, but in chimpanzees and in monkeys. So a quick neuroscience refresher, there are 2 visual systems in the brains of all higher primates, human, chimpanzee, and monkey. One system is looking for color, detail, and texture. The other visual system, which operates in parallel, is looking for speed, direction, change of direction. Well, back in 2003, Professor Jerry Ann Alexander, who was at Yale, presented the first evidence that the system that's looking for speed and direction greatly predominates in males. The system that's looking for color, detail, and texture predominates in females. And this helps to explain some really robust findings. For example, when you give 3-year-olds a choice of playing with a doll or a truck, girls slightly prefer to play with a doll. Boys greatly prefer to play with a truck. Now, that's been known for 50 years, but when I encountered that research 40 years ago as a graduate student, we were told it's just a social construction of gender, that we teach girls to play with dolls and we teach boys to play with trucks. But then Jerry and Alexander gave the same choice to juvenile monkeys. And juvenile male monkeys prefer to play with a dull gray truck. Juvenile female monkeys prefer to play with a colorful doll. And this has also been found in chimpanzees. And these reflect these sex differences in the visual system. Why do boys prefer to play with a dull gray truck? Because it's got wheels. It goes kaboom. It moves. Why do girls prefer to play with a doll? Because it has a more interesting color and texture. And these differences are robust, meaning that you find them white and black, urban, rural, affluent, low income. You find them across all humans. And it's a great study at Auburn that I love to cite. So they wondered, what about butch girls?
Right,
what about
I've got to cut you off right
tomboys?
there because I think that this is so profound for us to see and understand those sex differences, male and female, everything from smell, hearing, sight, how little disagreements within marriage and dating and relationships maybe come back to the fact that we're wired differently as male and female. And as the gender battle ensues in the culture today, we have to understand that these sex differences are written so deeply into how we think, how do we interact, how we see, hear, smell, that giving a little bit of grace and room for one another to be a little different is okay. We'll be right back during our weekly marriage hour.
We're talking about what you're thinking about. You're listening to Trending with Timmerie on Relevant Radio and the Relevant Radio app.
I am absolutely amazed to learn about some of the sex differences that so significantly impact our dating, relationships, and marriage. Dr. Leonard Sax was just with me as we dove into the differences on the level of sight, smell, and hearing, and how women hear things far louder than men do. Women smell things stronger than men do, and we look at things differently. It's an absolutely riveting conversation, and I didn't have the opportunity to comment on this, but the neuroscience is fascinating. Gender matters, sex matters. Knowing that the biological reality is real and important is so important in the face of everything from Ketanji Brown Jackson saying she can't even say what a woman is. We'll get to that in a moment. To so-called Leah Thomas, who is a man competing, unfortunately, against women and being allowed to do so. All of this reminds us that we must stand by understanding and knowing and discovering the mystery of who we are as women and who we are as men. It's so important, and understanding that these differences impact the way we agree, disagree, how we have conversations, how we communicate, and how we perceive things. And I was just laughing for all the single people out there, ladies, gentlemen. I thought this was significant. I was just thinking about how Dr. Sax was discussing how sight is different between men and women, how women tend to focus on colors, textures, and details, and men focus more so when perceiving things via sight on speed and direction. Well, it's a reminder as to how important it is, gentlemen, if you're dating, to keep yourself up as well. We so often talk about women not letting themselves go physically. Well, men too. Keep the hair cut. Keep it combed. Be aware of facial hair. Be aware of how you smell. These things are so important on a very human level. God created us with body and a soul, and we have to pay attention to both. You want to be a full marriage material, you want to be a full package for someone, you want to date, you want to get married, well, think about your soul, think about your body, incorporate all elements. And I think that's what's so fun about these sex differences. God created us with these unique dimensions at so many levels, sex differences written to every part of the human body, and this was just a taste of understanding that today on Trending. Okay, coming up, I want to talk about Ketanji Brown Jackson, but first I want to invite you to return to Mass. If you've been away from Mass during COVID, out of concern, I want to invite you back. I know many parishes have special seating areas, or some Masses are lower in attendance if you do feel you need to social distance, but please come back to Mass. Receive our Lord Jesus Christ, body, blood, soul, and divinity at Mass. Tomorrow is a great day to return to Mass, the Feast of the Annunciation. That is of the angel Gabriel announcing to the Blessed Virgin Mary that she has conceived by the power of the Holy Spirit. This is the feast day we celebrate tomorrow. And public service announcement, that means tomorrow marks 9 months until Christmas. You're listening to Trending with Timmerie here on Relevant Radio. If you want to learn a little bit about the Mass, join and sign up. It's not too late for Father Rocky's Lenten lessons on the Mass. You can sign up at relevantradio.com. Today, Father Rocky talked about the prayers of the faithful. That's that moment after the homily and the creed where we participate in praying for our intentions. And it's an important reminder that so many of us tend to turn to God in those moments of need. But we're reminded in our need, in our prayer and our intercession, that God intervenes in time and space to answer our prayers. And the Annunciation is a feast day that reminds us of that Jesus Christ, body, blood, soul, and divinity, became incarnate. He became incarnate and present here on earth so that he might save us from our sins, that he might show to us the perfection of all humanity. So sign up for the Lenten lessons on the Mass. It's not too late. relevantradio.com. And tomorrow is a big day as we're talking about the Feast of the Annunciation. On this day, we will see that Pope Francis has asked Catholics worldwide to go to your church to pray for peace in Ukraine and with Russia, and to go to confession at this time. Wherever you are on Friday, join the Holy Father and bishops around the world in offering a prayer for peace. If you cannot visit a church to pray during this time, please listen to Relevant Radio on Friday as Father Rocky and Drew Mariani anchor our live coverage of this historic day at the Vatican. Beginning at 11 a.m. Central, we'll bring you live coverage as Pope Francis leads to celebrate the celebration of penance from St. Peter's Basilica. Then, approximately at 12:30 p.m. Central, you'll hear the Holy Father carry out the important act of consecration of Russia and Ukraine to the Immaculate Heart of Mary. You can pray the prayers online at relevantradio.com and follow along. All the prayers are there. Again, relevantradio.com. If you're not able to meet the Holy Father's request that we pray between the hours of 11 a.m. Central and 1 p.m. Central, please join us at Relevant Radio, listening and praying with our Holy Father. All coverage will be available online at relevantradio.com or on your local Relevant Radio station or app. Join the Universal Church tomorrow on the Feast of the Annunciation for this important consecration of Russia and Ukraine, as well as this penance service. You're listening to Trending with Timmerie here on Relevant Radio. Okay, Ketanji Brown Jackson. I have been wanting to get to this the last couple of days. I've shared with you, I think, just big picture where I'm coming from, I think is important. We need to pray that Ketanji Brown Jackson is not our next justice, and if she does become so, we still need to pray for her and all our justices, all of our leaders who we may disagree with, who are speaking false and absolute fallacies in their work. Ketanji Brown Jackson, her judicial incompetence and having been chosen due to identity politics is absolutely inadequate for the highest court in the United States, and it's offensive to women and children. And I'd like to explain and share with you a little bit as to why. We'll get in just a moment to where she can't define what a woman is. That was just, if you haven't heard that, it's ridiculous. But here's the deal. She is being very careful with what she does and doesn't answer during these confirmation hearings. What she answers really isn't going to change anything. We know the votes will most likely go in her favor, given the state of the Senate majority, essentially, because Kamala Harris is that deciding vote, since we're tied in the Senate in terms of numbers between the two parties. So she's really just trying not to say much because of that. So many of the questions she receives, she really just tries to answer vaguely or not at all, because the less fuel she can give to the opposition, the better. So tactically, she's doing well in that respect, but there are some things very clearly we need to understand. She's radically pro-abortion when she clerked, actually, for the very Supreme Court justice that she will be potentially replacing. She clerked and wrote on various abortion cases, and she has also spoken during these confirmation hearings that Roe versus Wade, she believes, and Planned Parenthood versus Casey, the two predominant leading abortion cases, governing abortion in this nation that she believes they're precedent-setting cases, that they set the standard for cases having to do with abortion. And so what she's saying is she's drawing a line in the sand, saying that she is in favor of these cases remaining law and not being overruled. Now, some other concerns about Ketanji Brown Jackson is that she has stood for reduced sentencing for child pornography abusers. Now, if you joined me yesterday on Trending, we spoke a lot about the importance, especially for women today, to be aware in the face of a culture that has become very dangerous at times with physical assault, sexual assault. I highly recommend you share yesterday's podcast, relevantradio.com/trending, or wherever you catch your podcast, with a loved one, because the reality is stories such as coming out of Florida are absolutely outrageous, of a woman who was, there was an attempted rape at a Walmart in Florida in the middle of the day. I mean, what this points to, and I drew the connection, was to the crisis of pornography in our culture. That pornography has become a pornography addiction, and addiction has turned to behavioral side effects and outright crimes that we've seen. This was Ted Bundy's story. He started with pornography when he was a little kid and became a serial killer. And just look up his story from the 70s. Check out his interview that he did with, I believe, the head of Focus on the Family at the time. He shared his story, that this is how dehumanizing pornography is. And so the fact that Ketanji Brown Jackson is willing to reduce sentencing for child pornography abusers is absolutely unacceptable. And she's done it countless times. There are practically over a dozen cases where she's reduced sentencing. And it's important that we are sharing that this is the reality, because the reality is that we've also seen as a justice, as a judge, she has terrible prudence when it comes to making proper decisions. A number of her cases, actually 1 in 10, have been overruled by other judges. And as a district judge for the DC Federal District Court, she was one of the most frequently reversed judges. This does not mean that she knows how to make sound judicial decisions that are prudent. And I think that coming back full circle, and this is kind of the kicker that we'll talk about here, Ketanji Brown Jackson was chosen because, as has been stated many times before, because she's a woman and because she's black. This is offensive to women. This is offensive to black people. And we should not be playing identity politics. It's not a celebration of women. And just to prove that, listen to what she has to say when it comes to defining what a woman is. She was asked today this question. So here's the audio. She was asked today this question. Of can you give me a definition for what a woman is? Listen to this.
Not in this context.
So
I'm not a biologist.
The meaning of the word woman is so unclear and controversial that you can't give me a definition?
Senator, in my work as a judge, what I do is I address disputes. If there's a dispute about a definition, people make arguments, and I look at the law and I decide.
Well,
so I'm not.
The fact that you can't give me a straight answer about something as fundamental as what a woman is underscores the dangers of the kind of progressive education that we are hearing about. Just last week, an entire generation of young girls watched as our taxpayer-funded institutions permitted a biological man to compete and beat a biological woman in the NCAA swimming championships. What message do you think this sends to girls who aspire to compete and win in sports at the highest levels?
Senator, I'm not sure what message that sends. If you're asking me about the legal issues related to it, those are topics that are being hotly discussed, as you say, and could come to the court.
Wow, this is a Senator Marsha Blackburn asking potentially our next Supreme Court justice to give a definition for what a woman is and to address specifically the issue of Will Thomas beating women in women's sports. And Ketanji Brown Jackson refuses to define women. In fact, I was watching Australian news and they were making fun of her today. The fact that she can't even respond to a basic question about what a woman is. Why is she going to be our next Supreme Court justice? We need to pray for her. We need to pray for our nation and pray that truth and Christ's vision for humanity reigns. March 25th is the Feast of the Annunciation. This is Timmerie from Trending with Timmerie. We'll discuss the significance of the Feast of the Annunciation, as well as be joined by licensed marriage and family therapist Michael Gasparo to talk about so-called Leah Thomas, a man who competed for 3 years as a man swimming and now is competing as a so-called woman and beating women. So join me Friday as we discuss at 6 p.m. Central on Relevant Radio or the Relevant Radio app.